Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Hi, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. In today's episode, part 2 from our previous discussion on Edenity's take on enlightenment, what happened in 2012 and why it matters to you, the difference between the predual and the non-dual, how the ego is a unalistic verb rather than a dualistic noun, the hidden dualisms inside non-dual paradigms, and if that wasn't all confusing enough for you, much, much more. I remind you, as always, to please listen to this podcast from the beginning and in order. Thanks so much for listening. Well, welcome forward, everybody, to this is episode 34.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. We still have things to say.
And I think that thought probably 5 times a week.
Yeah,
We still have things to talk about after almost 40 years on this dusty road.
yeah. I don't know how dusty. I see it as like it's like when you have a clear piece of land and you throw a bunch of seeds down. And it looks not so lush, but it's on the way. It's on the way.
Okay, good
as
enough.
long as the birds don't eat it and the wind doesn't blow too hard. So
Yes.
as I told you last time, I titled 33 Enlightenment versus Mental Body Ensoulment, which is a distinction I don't know if we made directly. No, here and there we did directly, but I think it was a cool distinction because it's tricky how Edenity, it appears to make Zen and enlightenment important, but also recast it in a completely different way.
Yes.
Being about healing of fear, and it's really tricky to get that across, the difference, because there's so many similarities, but some really subtle but critical differences as well.
Yeah. Let me speak to one of those that comes to my mind eye right this moment, and that is that it's mental body ensoulment in Edenity because it is about losing the slavery default state of our identity, our self-sense, as being sourced in the mind, as opposed to being sourced in the soul. And this is based on the bigger picture identity, which I think our next series, 1 or 2, again, will be on sainthood. We can go into the next level on sainthood also.
I'd love to, yeah.
That in between lifetimes, we retain a sense of self. And in between lifetimes, we have a mind also that abstracts our experience, even in the spirit domain. So our mind eye is part of our soul eye that pre-exists and post-exists our incarnative status in earth. And since there's a mind eye inside the soul eye in between lives, there is a mind eye inside the soul eye even here as we express as human form. And the fact that our soul, and we'll get to maybe in the next podcast, Joseph, our soul is our body is all soul, but our soul is not all body.
The rhombus versus square principle again.
Yes, exactly. In that sense, the body is the soul in expression in this domain. And but just because the body is all soul, though, doesn't mean the soul is all body. There is a soul eye, even as human beings, that is a deeper eye than the mind eye of dualisms. And we'll get to that distinction here today, I think.
It's ironic there, because right there you de-dualize mind versus true nature. Like a lot of Zen paradigms use that term, true nature. You de-dualize that and immediately throw light on the throwing the baby out with the bathwater, the dissolution of the ego, which I know we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's why when we call it, we don't use the word enlightenment, because I was always confused in history. The age of enlightenment.
I know, it's all
in
mind.
Europe was all mind, right? So enlightenment has been overused in so many different ways, and has been cheapened, in my opinion. You can say enlightenment about anything. So mental body ensoulment means our seat of consciousness moves from the mind eye by default, which we're all conditioned to, well, that's our default, to the soul eye. That's what happens in what's been formally called enlightenment. It's not about the end of self, it's about the end of the slavery to the mind eye mediated self, allowing a first opening for the soul eye to become the center of our I-ness or our I sense.
And that's
And
actually, we would say to a Zen master, that's where your remaining preferences are coming from. They're
exactly.
not just arising out of thin air and dissipating back into it. They're actually coming from something that has existence but not substance, or something like that.
Existence, but not substance, right? Not substance relative to the energy and matter kind of definition of substance that we are saddled with. And so that's right. The disillusion, moving from mind eye to soul eye does not mean there is no I. In other words,
Yes.
the Zen tract, the Eastern tract means because the I, as we go back to what we said earlier, I think, maybe not last week, but last time, that the point of meditation is to seek the meditator and find that the meditator cannot be found. Let me say that again, because this is not out there in Western enlightenment or Zen tracts. I've never heard it that way. I've heard it once. No, I'm sorry. I have heard it once, but with a little different wording. The goal of meditation is to seek the meditator, not to obliterate thoughts, not to watch thoughts. Those are means. Those are tactics.
Yeah.
That's secondary to the bigger plan. In that sense, when we meditate, we're supposed to look for the meditator and eventually find that the meditator cannot be found. Once we get close to that precipice, we start to, in an ideal world that made up of older souls, you start to feel a terror of the loss of self when you start realizing you can't find the meditator. And that's the beginning. That's opening the door to the room of the terror of not being. So relative to the stream that we're talking about right now, I completely understand, or Identity completely gets why for thousands of years the mind-based eye has been called an illusion, but for a different reason than the one that was diagnosed. It's less real than the mind eye or the soul eye. The mind eye is less real than the soul eye, but that doesn't making it being less real doesn't make it unreal.
I know, it's just making me crazy today for some reason. I'm getting it on a deeper level. Like, they should love that because that's non-dual, right?
Yeah.
And they should go, oh, we've been dualistically relating to X versus Y.
Yes.
And so this way of putting them together, and it's like, no, one's realer than the other, but they're both real, should satisfy the metaphysics of non-dual teachings.
It should.
It should, but
it doesn't.
Yeah.
No. Excuse me. That idea is so elusive. How dualistic and exclusive transcendence-based Zen, as we talked about last time, or transcendence-based enlightenment paths, how dualistic it is. Anything that's exclusive is an either or.
And that's exactly, then you've got to create a self-imagic, spiritualized self in order to fill that gap, and it's off to the races, as we often say. It puts the seeker of enlightenment in an impossible situation, because they have to transcend something that's untranscendable, and then what they would call the ego in their paradigm would have to then fabricate that, which goes against the very thing that they say they're going to do. There's the noose that you used to talk about, the noose of traditional Buddhism. It just
exactly they hang themselves on the not noose of their not teaching, and then but experientially it seems to self-validate itself. That whole thing, you see, and that's where the rub. There's where the rub is, because you can expose the faulty metaphysics fairly directly, like you just did. You summarized it beautifully. But people who enlighten really do have a sense of a loss of self. And so they go to the place that confirms the assumption they were taught in the first place.
Yeah, but if you have unhealed mother issues when you're projecting your mother all over your mate, it seems really real too. I mean, it's just, it's a more subtle, sophisticated form of it.
Exactly. Just because the sun looks like it moves through the sky doesn't mean the sun moves through the sky. Just because it seems like the self is an illusion doesn't make the self as an illusion. Remember how pre-scientific and pre-psychological the Eastern path is, and it's not been updated adequately at all to the modern day, which is what Edenity, why it weighs in with a whole other recasting. As you said, it's a great word. So let's tackle this whole idea. Let's go to the next level with this mind eye, which we have called the ego for centuries. One of my favorite anecdotes, I think I've said it in another podcast, is watching a Rinpoche on a stage throw a hat down on the floor and start jumping up and down on it, saying, "This is the ego, kill it. This is the ego, kill it." And he just, of course, while doing that, he exposed his ego doing that to his own ego.
Decidedly dualistic.
Decidedly dualistic. So here's how Edenity comes in with it. So I've got to do a little prepping to get there. There's a whole the basic illusory dualism in Eastern teaching is the dualism of dualism versus non-dualism. Okay. Now, a lot of teachers will say, in a practical sense, there is no versus between dualism and non-dualism. And that's true after enlightenment. That's the sensation. That's what they experience. There's no more fight anymore because one side, but the reason there's no fight there because one side has won and the other side has lost.
Wow.
Do you see? It's like when you adjust a lens on a camera for a faraway a picture of a mountain, everything in the front, right in front of you, gets blurry, right? It's the same principle here. It's so obvious that the only reason it feels like it's non-dualism and dualism after enlightenment there's no conflict is because one side's already won and the other side's lost.
Reminds me of that person that you talked to many episodes ago who emailed you following the collapse of EBU 1.0. Just so you'll know who it is. He once said jokingly, I'll never forget it, was so funny. He said, yeah, there's an and. I'm right and you're wrong. Just basically
that's exactly right.
That's what Zen does. Yeah, there's an and. This is
really,
there's
exactly
no fight.
Right. And one of the persons who really helped me years and years ago get a foothold in Europe, her non-dual teacher explicitly said the teacher is always right.
Oh dear.
And the student is always wrong. Okay. Now this was an intrinsic part of this guy's teaching. Now, if I had ever had a chance to meet him, which I didn't, I would point out this glaring dualism in what he is saying there. He would
an attachment to it.
Oh my! Over attachment to it. It's always and never are over attachments. How can you not get that? And he was enlightened. I mean, I saw. She told me some things he said, and I felt through her to him, and he was enlightened. But he would answer, "Well, my expression of it is dualistic, but my embodiment of it isn't."
Oh, come on! Oh man!
No, but can you see how that follows his truth and how self-evident it is to him? Do you see?
Because he's living in the essence of it, but expresses it dualistically. And because expression in dualism is dualistic, then it somehow forgives the trespass out of the non-dual essence or something.
Oh, man. Yes, Joseph. I never put it in that phraseology. That's exactly right. It's they let themselves off the hook there disintegrously.
Well, and you just made a distinction I haven't heard you make before, which is that we can point at someone and say, yes, you're enlightened, but not mental, body, and soul.
Yes, exactly.
And
Oh, good point.
that's
Yes.
new. So that we can honor, yes, you're at the
Yes,
top of this paradigm, and there's all
absolutely.
sorts of real stuff there, and it's an incomplete model.
It's it hit its Peter principle probably well, maybe 300 years ago, and now it's just been wallowing around, justifying and trying to morph into a Western mind digestible place, which just
Yeah,
weakens it even further.
yeah.
So the point here is that, let me repeat that, so we'll go forward again. The basic dualism, it's an existential dualism represented by a dualistic expression. That we're not talking about the dualistic expression now. The basic existential paradigmatic dualism in non-dual teachings is duality versus non-duality. One is chock full of Mayic substantiveness, and the other is absent of Mayic self-substantiveness. You can't say that's not a versus. One is chock full of Mayic dualistic substantiveness, and non-duality is absent. It's the exact opposite of that.
Yeah,
So
at its most basic level, it's a really fundamental value system of non-dual good, dual bad,
yes,
which they
exactly
can't
right.
admit because that would be too sharp a dualistic distinction.
Exactly. So what always bothers me is, my particular odd kind of gift is, if the metaphysics expressions and outcomes all don't resonate, something's wrong with the whole system,
Mm.
right? So if there's a denial of this basic existential level dualism that I just said two or three times, by the time you got all the way out to enlightenment, it's been damage in, damage out.
Mm-hmm.
The damage starts with the denial of the existential level dualism in dualism versus non-dualism. This is not just We're not just intellectually masturbating here, as I have been accused in the past of doing and making this. It's a fundamental, as you just said, it's a fundamental schism and defect in non-dual teachings.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that's a tough one. I think like I spoke to you a little bit last time because I never thought you were intellectually masturbating because I loved the intellectualism of it before, but
mhm,
then after my non-dual illumination, and then having to
mhm,
claw my way back into the dualism that I was transcending unconsciously, now I
mhm.
have a whole different appreciation of it because I actually had the experience. And even though it was really difficult and took about a year to get even traction on returning to the soul I was trying to leave, the soul some part of me was trying to leave behind. I,
Yeah.
I don't know if it can really be appreciated unless you go through something like that. So to someone who would accuse you of intellectual masturbating, I would say, well, try losing a part of yourself out the top of your seventh chakra and clawing your way back. It becomes very real then.
Yes. You have directly the direct experience, of the distinction between the tabula rasa that your mind eye has been reduced to after a pure non-dual enlightenment, and realizing that I didn't think my dualistic self would ever come back, but it did,
Mm.
quite rapidly, in terms of, if you look at it that way, within 3 months, 2.5 months, it slammed back into perspective. And so then becomes the question is, why did it? Am I stuck halfway between enlightenment and non-dual enlightenment? All that kind of stuff. But this is a fundamental schism, dualism, that has never been fully appreciated. It's been denied innocently by the experience of younger souls who, in one way of saying, believe just because they experience the sun is moving in the sky, the sun really is moving in the sky. When they say there's no one home, or that they deny that fundamental dualism versus non-dualism.
Hmm.
So now that's behind us. Let's go on to ego. The
Mm.
point being here, a reason I needed to introduce that first in terms of semi-linearity with this arcana that we're talking about here, uh, is that Edenity solves this dualism versus non-dualism by introducing the idea that there's something in between dualism and non-dualism that changes the story completely, because it's a felt experience, not an intellectualized experience, where halfway between dualism and non-dualism is something, the all I can call it is unalism. Unalism. If that is true, if that is possibly true, then we have a not so much a linear, but an unfolding essence form expression. We have non-duality as in this formulation as essence, unalism as form, and dualism as expression. There's a link here, and that's since there is a unalism, there's no such thing as unalism in non-dual teachings, at least traditional ones, right? And here's where ego comes in, and the whole thing that got confused when Buddhism moved from India to China and Japan. And that is, now let's unpack ego inside of this double context. Ego is a unalistic verb, not a dualistic noun.
Cool.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The East has always, whether they intended to or not, nounified the ego, and inside that nounification premise said it doesn't exist. Well, that noun doesn't exist. In its place is non-duality. That's their basic formulation, right? But ego is actually a unalistic verb, not a dualistic noun at all. And a best metaphor for ego is a river. Okay, a river is a dualistic thing in one domain. It's as opposed to the land, the ground that's on either side of it that forms its flood banks, right? It is a noun that way, but in the next level of content, the river is a verb, because as so many people say, you can't stand in the same river ever. The moment that you register that you're standing in ankle deep in a river, the river has already changed what it was before. So it's an ever-changing unalism. This is the best way to get what a unalism is. And I offer that calling the ego a verb, not a noun, a unalistic verb, completely resonates with the Buddha's original teaching of the experiencer and the experience being the same thing. Can you see why that is? In other words, if ego is a river that is changing every moment, right? That's because experience is changing every moment. So our registration of outer experience as inner experience, which we've been calling the noun ego, after it all gets through with its cathections, right? But it's cathecting every moment. It didn't just cathect right now, it's cathecting every moment and supporting previous cathections, right? So all that experience is changing every moment, every single moment. Even if you're sitting still, you're now on your 10,144th heartbeat instead of your 10,143rd heartbeat. So who's fooling who here that there's any such thing as a noun? Now, if you call nouns an illusion, I'm right with you. Even a static object at the atomic level is not a noun, it's a verb.
At the level of essence, there's no such thing as a noun. Yeah.
At the level of essence, which is why if you call ego a noun and then contrast it with the essence of non-dual, it becomes an illusion or unreal.
But if you sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I've heard Adyashanti, for example, refer to the ego as he would say, well, it's better called an egoic process, and so sort of submits that it is in fact a verb. But then the question is like, well, what is it that you want to do with it? Yes. Because if you're trying to get rid of that process or supplant it, then it's sort of like you're taking the process, drawing a circle around it, and so nounifying it, and then trying to get it out of there. And then that is still kind of like a noun. It's like a meta noun.
Yes, good call, because his picture his enlightenment was based on transcendence. That's exactly as predictable, right? he'll meta-nounize the process, the verb. Let's say, let's go along with it. Let's agree with him and use our terminology that it's a non-dual, a unalistic, because it's not non-dual. The river is not non-dual, and a river is not strictly dual. It's unalistic. Same thing with the ego. The river of experience that's coming into us every moment creates a river out of our self-sense. Right?
But then, of course, the river can't be Maya that needs to be transcended. Then wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, they
Yes.
see the experience, the dualistic experience, and the dualistic self both need to be transcended,
Yes.
rather than seeing the unalistic aspect of the experience and the unalistic aspect of the self that are constantly co-arising.
Exactly. This is a modern translation of there's no difference between the experiencer and the experience.
Yeah.
Right. And Edenity would completely agree that that is absolutely true for the mind eye. For the mind eye, right? But for the soul eye lives as a meta-unalism to the unalism of our self-sense of ego. In other words, it's in our mind that the cathextion dynamic occurs. It doesn't happen in the soul eyes. The soul eye has already a registratable being, individualized being, that secondarily cathex experience. That soul, our soul eyes were created at our soul birth and had an eye intrinsic, a self-aware eye intrinsic to its birth, not artificially conditioned into it by experience. And that eye, our individualized eye, is a inheritance of the individualized eye of divine being. It's a fractal progeny of it. So this is why Zen and Eastern tracts can get away with what they've gotten away with for so many thousands of years, because they deny such a personally eyed kind of divine being that's Maya of religion, right?
Yeah.
And so any I-ness is got to be artificially and secondarily induced, not primarily structurally present at birth. The mind eye is not structurally existent at birth.
But the soul eye
but our soul eye already has an eye that pre-existed our mind eye. You see? So
well, yeah, which is weird because it's observable. A baby is an individual, and it doesn't have much of a mind eye in it to it,
right?
Yeah.
Right.
So
right.
I mean, you'd think that this would be kind of somewhat observable. Like, there's no mind going on there. What would an enlightened teacher say about the fact that the baby doesn't have any mental body?
Well, they would say that it has a physical body. That's why they call it the body mind.
Body mind,
right? The body mind. They reduce. It's a reductionism, a classic reductionism in philosophy. That they're reducing the subtle to the gross. All right. So all there is a massive brain tissue, and neurobiology is their best friend now. Is Eastern esotericism's best friend, because it signs the same agreement that our eye is nothing but created by the brain in response to experience. It's just not as esoterically phrased as the East did over 3,000 years ago, 2,400, 3,000, and even in the Hindu tradition, right? So inside of that track, we would say, if you said, well, look here's two babies, they're a year apart, no, let's say it this way, there's two newborns. One is fussing and fussing and fussing endlessly, and the other one is completely sedate, right? They're both babies. They don't have an eye yet, but these are very different beings. Neurobiology would come in and say, well, of course they're different, have different genetic influences. So their genes are governing how they're different, not any soul eye behind the curtain, right? But when you remember in between lives, like I do, and not just me, a lot of people remember what are in between eyes. There is an eye in between lives. And that's also why, to make sure the house all stays in metaphysical order, the most pure versions of Zen deny any reincarnation, deny any sort of soul as an immortality project, a projection, because you don't want to lose the I. Oh, I've got to believe it exists after death, right? An immortality project. Wilber's whole picture includes that with a little bit of asterisk on
Which
that.
is weird because on the way to awakening, people's third eyes tend to open, and it's
Yes.
not uncommon to start remembering past lives, and then that has
Yes.
to be transcended too.
That's just a projection of the I trying to losing itself.
Creating
Right.
more eyes and more other lives. Yeah.
I
Oh
mean,
boy.
I'm laughing. This is a tragedy. I've cried so many thousands of moments over my lifetime at this, what we're talking about, that it's almost comical now, especially since 2012, which I hope we get to today too,
Sure.
and how that's changed the Enlightenment game since
Well,
2012.
I mean, for me, it's like it's easy to laugh at the metaphysics, and then you meet someone who's been meditating transcendently for 20 or 30 years, and it's very easy to have your heart break over that because you can can feel that they've left their soul behind, and they're suffering because of it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So let's take one little sidestep and come at this same issue that we just argued, I think, pretty eloquently.
I think so. If we do say so ourselves.
If we do say our unalistic selves, right? There's another way of coming at this rather than noun verb, non-dualism or dualism versus unalism. There's another way of looking at this. If the ego is a unalistic verb, changing every moment in accordance, the mind eye, in accordance with our experience, its inexperienceability as a noun is plenty sufficient to create a terror of not being. In other words, to be reduced, that my default conditioned sense of mind eye is being created every moment, has no permanence. It is not a dualistic noun. Just reducing it to a unalistic, constant flowing, ever-changing thing is hugely disruptive to our conditioned nounified ego. So another way to recast all this experiencer, unalism, noun versus verb for ego, what they're experiencing in enlightenment is the inexperienceability, the impermanence of a nounified ego. Not a lack. It's not the non-duality is not the ultimate state of being or not being. That impermanence is the kind of enlightenment that the Buddha had. The Buddha had no teaching in his teaching about non-duality. There was no advaya. There was no absence of individualized self. It was all based on impermanency. His enlightenment was based on in our modern terms, recasting an identity, that the ego is a unalistic verb rather than the dualistic I, right? That alone imparted enlightenment in his day for him. And with that version of enlightenment, casting this whole thing in China and Japan into non-duality versus duality, he did not teach that. He just taught this. The inexperience of ego was so liberating for him, liberating that it's impermanent, that he didn't have to hold on and attach to anything. When it's held as a permanent noun, you've got to attach to dualistic dynamics to keep that dualistic noun in play. And when you lose that, and all of a sudden my ego is a river, there's a whole liberation from attachment and resistance immediately in that kind of enlightenment. But that kind of enlightenment creates an effusive aliveness as opposed to the dourness of most non-dual teachers. Adya is a bit of a exception, but he's not joyfully alive. He's muted. He's heartful, but his heartfulness. I haven't met you yet, but I hope to one day soon, Adya. your enlightenment is a muted aliveness. It's not a live aliveness. It's not joyfully overbrimming with expression of liberation. It's more constrained, and you have such a big heart.
Yeah, he does.
It hurts me to see it muted by a transcendence-based algorithm that you unfortunately went through, and I did too. I just found a way through it to the other side. So this is not any criticism. This is just a heartfelt because he's halfway there, but can't fit it, his experience in accordance with what his teachings have been in. And that's why we say non-dual masters, Joseph, they haven't lost their dualistic conditioning. They've just been reconditioned. They haven't been deconditioned. They've been reconditioned to their own set of dualistic principles and dharmas, and that say this is good, this is bad.
Yeah, exactly.
This is you see what I mean?
As long as there's a value system, there's conditioning, right?
Exactly right. So the Buddha and I would agree. We would say, let me put it in words here. Any sense of personal authorship of experience, any sense of a personal authorship of experience is only rendered inexperienceable because of its continual state of changingness. It's our ever-changingness that is enlightenment, not because it's an illusion.
The ever-change, yeah, it's like you can't actually experience a river. If you look closely, you'll see it changes too often. You can never experience it. And exactly, so it is with the self.
Right. And that's why the whole non-dual picture of things, whether they realize it or not, create a boogeyman called the noun ego versus the not noun ego that has never existed in the first place. The ego as a noun has never existed in the first place. They would say, yes, we agree that's an illusion relative to the non-dual. Yeah, but the non-duals where all I-ness goes to die. There's another way of looking at this, of interpreting the data. Another way to interpret the data to see that there is an I of soul and there is a dualistic, enlightenable mind I. But what happens is the mind I doesn't disappear. The mind I simply is outshined by the soul I, where the I of soul, it was a structural, not a conditioned version of I. It came out of a divinity that has an I also. Now, we can't compare our puny soul eyes even. Well, look at it this way. The puniest of all is the mind I. The next bigger thing, much more vast, is the soul I. And then compared to the I of divinity, we're just cogs in a wheel of its self-aware cogs in its wheel. We can't even compare the eyes. But in that sense, this is where we could say in Edenity, sagehood, pre-dual sagehood, is sainthood.
How so?
Because our soul I, which is liberated from the mind I in mental body ensoulment, came out of divine beings, yin divinities, pre-dual womb.
I see, because the inhabitation of soul into mind I is a sainthood movement, actually.
Yes. But it was never, since they have to deny a substantive God, Maya of religion, at least Hinduism says, well, there's a system, and we die, and maybe we aggregate with 10 other souls who made similar choices than ours, and that aggregate keeps reincarnating, and then there's a new aggregate that's a little less attached or resisting, and then a new aggregate, until finally one day you realize all aggregations are just one drop in the ocean of being that contracted on itself and thinks the individual drop is different than the ocean.
Now, all individualism is essentially illusion in that picture.
All individualism. So whether at least Zen, I like Zen better because, well, not only because it was my track, but because it gets the job done in one life.
Yeah.
Whereas Hinduism, it says, well, there's some sort of divine system bigger than the theater here that governs the aggregation to finally one day find itself equivalent to the ocean, and the drop disappears. Wait, that sounds great. Oh, into a indescribable non-dual ocean. They could say non-dual ocean. I've heard Advaita Vedantas call the ocean non-dual. So the only difference between the two is Zen says it only takes one life, and that's it. Lights out at death. Your mind eye is nothing but a product of your body mind, right? Experience. But at least the Hindus say, well, maybe it takes 1,000 years for yours and all the other aggregate souls like yours to finally realize the same thing. Zen gets done in one life, right? But that this somehow the system where reincarnation does take place, but one day ends up in the same place Zen does after one lifetime. There's got to be a divine system and intention to that whole system. Where did that intention come from if it's totally impersonal?
Yeah, that's right? A mystery is the only answer they can give you there. Yeah,
that's the mystery. Yeah, and so that's fine. Stick with Advaita. Stick with Vedanta if that's your choice of cheese this lifetime, and stick with Zen if that is yours too. But take this in that what if both systems are hopelessly outdated, and what if there's another way to interpret the same experience that non-dual masters have had for centuries, recast with a different substratum and a different metastratum?
You know, as a side note there, isn't it interesting how, like, in every realm of life, we are looking for the newest, most updated thing, you know, the next best burger and the next new iPhone and the next new medical advance. But with our value systems, we're like, oh, that 2,000-year-old thing, no, that was perfect just right then. Or like how the Amish are like, oh yeah, the amount of technology we had in 1860, that was the right amount of technology. No more. That was it.
Exactly. And Christian, Islam, Judaic, and I'm always missing one. Islam, Jewish, Christianity, and
Buddhism, Hinduism.
Oh yeah, mass consciousness Buddhism. Yeah. Hinduism. That's the last one. Hinduism. But Buddhism has its own Maya version of itself, with all the idols and the incense and all that stuff.
Yeah, we when it comes to value systems, we're totally fine with no updates. But if you know we don't get a new free update to our phone's OS every 8 months, we're incensed.
Yes,
but exactly. That we want the same.
Yeah, and isn't that's the problem altogether? Beautifully summarized in one meta picture of things, that we hold on. Even those who say they are free from attachments are attached to a 2,400-year-old Buddhist system, value system, or a 4,500-year-old India Advaita system, esoterically. Yeah. And they can't change. Literally, pure Zen's premises and Advaita Vedanta's premises cannot evolve. Roman Catholicism's picture can't evolve. It can go around the mountain in 1,000 different ways. Oh, now in 1,001 different ways, but it never goes higher up the ladder of consciousness. It's got to stay where it is, because that's its Catholicism anyway. Its picture is tradition is immutable.
That's same with Judaism, which is basically the same thing.
Same.
Yeah, because it's like I often will say the phrase, how observing how people want their outsides to change while their insides stay the same. They want different results without having to change anything on the inside, because that's too scary. Because that would put them in the impermanence river, where they saw that actually they're in constant state of change if they would just allow that to happen.
And you know, that's a beautiful way to put it. And if we use that thought right back to the Buddha, his enlightenment, the basis of his enlightenment was sufficient to explain all enlightened states, and it never needed the burden of non-duality versus duality, existential meta-dualism that got infected, grafted onto his teaching when Bodhisattva went east to both north and east to China, Japan, then Thailand, in Hinayana traditions as opposed to Mahayana traditions. So The Buddha's the inexperienceability and impermanence of ego rendered it a verb. And if it's not a noun, there's nothing to obliterate. He would say the ego never existed in the first place. There's nothing to kill. But they would say nowadays, see, he's talking about that the ego never existed.
Therefore, we got to get rid of it.
Exactly.
No. That's different.
Right. The same statement cast in completely antithetical interpretations.
Yeah.
What he meant by that. So let's just erase the board here. What the Buddha meant is that there is nothing to transcend because it never existed in the first place. Not because it never existed in the first place, but because it's a verb. It's inexperienceable as a noun. And that's the algorithm the Buddha taught as a really practical, alive kind of enlightenment. If you wind up going through 30 years in a drafty monastery, avoiding carnal thoughts and watching your belly button exude nothing, okay, that's fine. But that produces a dour, like we said, a dour, subdued, muted humanism to the enlightened personality. And that was the exact opposite as the Buddha. He was the lion of the Shakyas, exactly as Jesus 400 and some years later was called the Lion of Judah. Wait a minute, wait, what? They were the same soul in two different incarnations, right? According to Edenity and lots of other esoteric sources also.
And you see that with enlightened teachers, they tend to become more muted over time, don't they?
Yeah.
Some of them start pretty, like Adida was pretty alive guy in his younger years.
Oh, yeah, as long as he had his circle of sex with seven, circle of seven.
Well, that'll keep an older man young.
Going. Perhaps. It will for a while. Yeah. And we talked in another podcast, didn't we, Joseph? Remind me if we already talked about this.
As if I remember. I'll try.
Or either way, Adida, he acquired this passion for photography as he got older, right? Which
we haven't talked about that. Yeah.
Didn't we? He got so into photography, and it's not bad actually. You look at some of it; it's informed by his enlightenment. But he got so attached to his photography, even though he said he wasn't. He had that camera between him and raw reality, and the photos he took were abstractions of experience. Just about the most dualistic thing you can do. Now, why would he get drawn to do that? If his enlightenment was the avatar that everybody claims he was. Wilbur called him the most advanced consciousness ever born in the history of humankind.
Ever born? How would he know that?
Born. Ask Ken. He was a devotee of his for a long time. He got a little soured on the circle of seven women too, I think, but I'm not sure about that.
And it also remember the John de Ruyter, it was a trifold brochure printed on two sides, and we counted 7 different pictures of him on it.
Yes.
Similar thing. Like, why would you want 7 pictures of you on a trifold brochure? That's kind of a lot for someone who doesn't think
doesn't exist.
Is important. Yeah, it's a lot of pictures of someone who doesn't exist.
What? Wait a minute. What? It's the same thing with the Malas in Osho's kingdom. You know, I mean, all had to wear a little picture of Osho, the one who doesn't exist as a self. What? Oh, I confronted an ex-Oshoite about that. Oh, he just wanted to show us, like his 98 limousines, that excess and poverty are the same thing. He's exploding dualisms there. He wanted us to wear his picture to show what is not a self. And really, did he tell you that? No. Just I think my meditation leader said that.
Yeah, well, they had to come up with something.
Oh, wow. God. I mean, when they shoehorn obviousnesses into distorted forms based in their beliefs instead of what really is, that's part of the problem we're having today in the obliteration of semantics. Semantics and reality in our language has been divorced by Trumpism. And that's another whole topic, of course. So the point being here is that both Eastern and Western spiritualities can be made evolvable, but
Mm.
not without breaking some dishes at the base of their assumptions about reality.
Mm-hmm.
You can't evolve an older picture into a newer picture without breaking some eggs, making an omelet. And the assumption here that we're contravening here is the basic meta dualism of non-dualism is real, dualism is ephemera maya. One is good, one is bad. That's it.
Yeah, I think
Uh,
of Aristotle's everything is made of earth, fire, air, and water.
yeah,
Just the idea of things
yeah,
are made of fundamental component parts was the birth of physical science. Like, that's a really important idea. But if
yeah.
you are clutching it, you're never going to get the 120 plus elements on our periodic table.
Oh, another great metaphor, Joseph. So, what identity is planting seeds for is the end of 2,000 to 5,000-year-old teachings about divinity or the nature of the personal self. It's saying, sorry, folks, it should have ended in the Renaissance to some degree, but it didn't. In Europe, in the West, it just became a little more condensed into indulgence of Maya from in
In
their
other
picture.
words, you want to change the one thing in people that they're the least willing to change.
Um, I'm not trying to change it,
Yeah.
uh, but yes.
It's
Uh,
amazing you haven't been assassinated yet.
well, the date is early. If
I'm being a
I
little
actually
flip here, but it's true.
no. I have no illusions that if Identity's message got out there in any sort of influential way, my life is in danger.
Yeah. I mean,
It
a
would be in
cartoon of
danger.
Muhammad got people killed. This is way bigger than that.
This is saying, sorry, all of your gods are false gods in the
Yeah.
West, and all of your not gods are false gods in the East.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
always started holy wars or serious conflict in the history of the history of
and,
consciousness.
I mean, I used to have quite a caustic edge to me, which I just don't have much anymore. So I'm not rallying the troops to make warfare on Eastern and Western spirituality. I'm simply
Whatever that would
saying,
look like. Yeah.
whatever that would look like, I'm simply saying, folks, stop, breathe, breathe, breathe. It's time for an update. What's so threatening? If your truth is the truth, I'm a complete heretic. What do you care what I say?
Mm.
If a born again Christian says you're going to hell, to the seventh level of hell because you've insulted my Jesus, I would say, well, uh, that's my problem, right?
Yeah, they must be pleased about that.
Yeah, aren't you happy when they're going like this? I've had someone say you're going to hell for what you've said. I got that once, and
Hmm.
I said exactly that. I said, well, why aren't you smiling?
Yeah,
I'm a
justice will be
heretic.
served. Yeah.
Right. Well, what's the problem? I've got the problem. You don't. Why are you threatened by my disagreement with you?
Yeah.
And here we come back to why this very question of my physical safety at some point,
Yeah.
possibly, I hope not, but that you're only threatened by a new version of your shtick if you're unsure about your version, the opposite of how it holds in people. The person who said that absolutely believed in the Bible literal, absolutely believed dinosaurs and humans traded airspace and oxygen, um, absolutely believed that the fossils were put there by the paternalistic God
Oh,
to
to test
test
our
our faith.
faith. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean,
Hmm.
this guy was absolutely sure. And I offered to him very gently, as best as I could at the time. I had some causticity to me still. Um, I said, why am I threatening to you if you're right and I'm wrong? You could only be threatened by me if you're unsure of your shtick.
Yeah.
Now, this would say this to a radical Islamist, a radical
Muslim.
suicide bomber.
Oh.
Why are you threatened by the devil, the infidels? They're all going to hell. Why you should be happy about the injustice? Why do you have to kill yourself? This is why also I always got when monks, not so much Zen monks, but um, uh, um, the Dalai Lama's version of monkhood, when they
Tibetan
set
Buddhism.
themselves on fire in protest of the Vietnam War. Remember when that was happening? Well, you were
Sure.
younger. Um, they're already halfway out the self place. Setting their body mind on fire is not a big deal. But they would only do that if they already felt that their one way of looking at things was the way. So they set themselves on fire in protest. It's another version of it.
Reminded of that article. Remember a while back, there was like two conflicting sects of monks or something, and they didn't have any weapons, so they were throwing typewriters at each other.
Yes, something like that. Yes, I remember that too. Yes, I remember that. So, wisdom of the day that's not really attached to the pre-dual picture here, and that is anyone who's threatened by anything you say is not sure of their worldview, or else they would not be bothered by your disagreement of it.
Yeah.
Basic consciousness 101A.
Well, and there's science for that. It's called the backfire effect, which has been studied with political parties. If they expose, the University of Minnesota or Michigan did it in 2015 or so. It was fascinating. They would take registered Democrats and Republicans and then show them negative information about their party, actual facts, and then they would test to see whether it eroded their belief in their party, left it the same, or strengthened it. And overwhelmingly, it caused them to be more strongly believing their party when it should have done the opposite. And they call it the backfire effect.
Reminds me something recently happened here in California. I think it was California. It was in the news. I'm not making this up really, because it applies to the whole, for example, chemtrails nonsense. Oh, yeah. They were installing 5G equipment, which looks different than the 4G. If you looked on the post, the telephone posts, or they're much more involved. Mm-hmm. And the local internet provider wanted to show its concern for the citizens. So the citizens were starting to call and say, is that 5G? Is that 5G? So they got a bunch of these people who were complaining about it. Have you noticed any symptoms? Oh my God. Since those things have gone up,
I know where this is going.
Dizzy. Mm-hmm. I got dizzy. I got nauseous. I got brain fog. It's unbelievable. And they garnered like 24 of these people who said something like that. And then they had an open hearing, and there's an angry people who are, not torches like in the old days, but get this evil 5G. And they let them. I wish I was there. The people were up at the front, just let them rant, rave, and then said, "Okay, folks, thanks. It was really helpful. And just so you know, we haven't turned it on yet."
I knew it.
Right. People who say about this chemtrail stuff, conspiracists, they don't know basic science. Mm-hmm. Jet air from airplanes is hot. The air temperature at 30,000 feet is cold. Mm-hmm. That heat trail forms fog in the same way fog forms when cold air mass hits hot air mass. Mm-hmm. These chemtrails are simply exhausts of normal jets, not disseminating poison to poison you. I've never met a true scientist, maybe they exist, who believes in chemtrails. As if you realize what kind of massive worldwide conspiracy that would be. No critical thinking. And that's the point I just want to make on that little aside there, is that critical thinking is lost in both Eastern and Western spiritual teachings. They don't have doubt about their own picture. They are over-attached to it. They're so sure of it. They don't allow critical thinking, which is doubt your own picture, in order. If they had doubt, there'd be doubt space for evolving, for evolution. Evolution requires doubt space. So this isn't going to happen anytime soon, as we say so often.
Well, that might be a good entree into, if it makes sense, to talk about the incredibly disorienting process of learning to experience yourself as impermanent.
Okay.
Because I know some of the answers inside myself about why people grip so hard to their beliefs and why they have no doubt space. But what is Edenity's take on that?
Of why they don't have doubt space?
Yeah.
Well, it's it's based on one of the three premises of identity, and that is we're all responsible for the contents of our unconscious, right? And so all that lack of doubt space comes out of a lack of emotive food in childhood. In other words, the basic wounds in the personhood track of identity is that no parent, this is not a criticism of parents, it's a criticism of parenting, that no parents ever born ever gave any child ever the experience that they felt what they were feeling while they were feeling it and why they were feeling it 90% of their childhood. No child has ever been raised with that. And because of that, we have never formed an inner soulful version of I, because we were been starved of heart food, soul food, basically heart soul food from the beginning, because our parents weren't soulful enough, too busy, otherwise damaged. They didn't self-authenticate before they became parents. So we produce generation after generation after generation that have to over-attach to belief systems to give themselves some sort of survival identity. They don't have a soulful, heartful, emoto-based identity. So they're all coming from lack. That lack causes them to overcompensate and grab or resist, and down the tubes goes critical thinking and doubt space. Emotional wounding, emotional body wounding. That's why Edenity offers that before you get substantively into sage track or sainthood track, you've got to do personhood track to create that lack of lack. When you go through personhood, at some point, you finally get reconstituted of what was missing in childhood, because this is an emotive-based paradigm that says you're emoto spiritual first before you're anything else, which is why even the personhood track is spiritual in Edenity.
Yeah.
So that's the short answer, is that we're all emotionally wounded by default. We all identityless by default. Some identitylesses get attracted to identityless paradigms. Some identityless people get attracted to overcompensating self paradigms. They're both equally Maya from Edenity's point of view. Transcenders and Mayers are absolutely two sides of the same illusory arc. So that's the reason why there's loss of critical thinking. But let's revisit something we didn't quite complete last time about the transcendence-based track for sagehood, and I'd like to put another term out there a little more definitively. If you focus on where thoughts, ideas, images, that which constitutes your illusory self, supposedly, and you watch them dissipate and die, you're focusing on the transcended version by watching them arise, dissipate, and die. Okay, they're all going into the transpersonal, but we're talking about pre-personal, not pre-personal in the immature way, not the pre-trans fallacy. This is a different cut through the same verbal pie or semantic pie, but it's a whole different domain. That when you focus on where do they come out of, not where they dissipate into, you get a whole other take of what the whole mystery is here. In that sense, transcendence-based algorithms of enlightenment are always dissociative. They're always exclusive, either ors, right, wrongs, bad, goods, even though they say they don't have those dualities anymore. Whereas prescendence, I want to introduce the term prescendence, predual based orientation to watching where thoughts, images, and all the things that show up as a self, supposedly, what do they arise out of? That's what we call avrashana meditation in Edenity, as opposed to vipassana. Vipassana is a transcendence based. Avrashana is a predual based, and we have a whole exercise that's really powerful to create a disorientation really quickly based on predual versus transdual. So when I say presentence is associative and not dissociative, you've got to split yourself from your soul in non-dual teachings, because there is no soul. That's an immortality project. Whereas when you look at the pre-dual, you discover for the first time, and this is the reboot of the evolution of Eastern teachings, that the pre-dual is the pre-dual womb of yin divinity, out of which our soul eye, way upstream of our mind eye, was created. And so when you focus on where thoughts arise, images, feelings arise out of, you discover a whole other terrain of what is called a non-duality, only we call a pre-duality. What does duality arise out of? I've never seen the term pre-dual anywhere in all my life. Maybe it's out there for Eastern teachings, traditional ones. It's always transdual, non-dual, not pre-dual, non-dual. So that's a point I wanted to make. And also how one other point we didn't make last time, so I make sure it's in here, is since 2012, yin divinity has shifted to be the aegis for the human condition. Up until 2012, the yang-based aspects of divine being ruled the roost to get us to a certain survival place as a species. And now we're at a survival place where we're ruining the planet, using up our resources, falling into old tribal camps of disagreement. We have wars now held in the media instead of on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And so what happened, why this is all happening, is in 2012, yin divinity, finally, divine being, maybe this was planned all along. I'm not God, so I don't know, but I'm interpreting the events, that our survival support ended in 2012 because divine being realizes now we've got to go with a thrival. We have evolved enough, and now to the point of actually threatening ourselves. I guess it's time. 2012, yin divinity came into play. And when yin divinity came into play, the yin aspect, the yin source of pre-duality, also began to start to infuse the substrata of our consciousnesses, meaning the old track of transcendence-based enlightenment has been, the plug's been pulled, but like a freight train that's been running for 2,400 years, say a 200-car freight train going at 60 miles an hour, you turn off the engine, how long is it going to glide on momentum, right? Same principle here. The yang-based God stepped back, and the yin-based God stepped forward, and all the yang-based patriarchy and old school teachings, both East and West, have been unplugged but are on momentum. And that momentum only without the plug is causing all this crap that's been pushed down by Yanga influences up into the surface and choking on, if we read the news every day, we choke on all this crap that's all coming out.
Well, and you said that the survival support is given way to thrival support.
Yes.
But the governing dynamic of that is all of the shit coming out, not suddenly, sandwiches growing on trees. Things are
exactly.
Things are getting they can no longer be hidden because they have to be dealt with for thrival to be possible.
Exactly right. What do we have in the three entities in Hinduism? Brahma, Shiva, and
Atman?
No, begins with a V, doesn't it?
Vishnu?
Vishnu. Vishnu is the steady state result of Brahmic as is being upset by Shivic change and evolving, creating a new steady state Vishnu. This is constantly going evolving every moment. We're in a Shiva stage where the Brahma, if I can use this metaphor, the Brahma of a survival-based dynamic of humanity's consciousness is giving way on its way to a new Vishnu of thrival. And for that to go from Brahma to Vishnu, there has to be a Shiva a stage. And we are chuck in the middle. It's only been 10 years since the shift. And look at our institutions, look at our discourse, look at the mess that everything is happening. This is the swamp that was always there. But now with internet and technology, we're all aware of it every moment, every moment, every moment. Yeah. Take heart. This is a transition place to a new Vishnu. It may take another 50 or 100 years. I don't know. I hope not, because I think we'll nuke ourselves if it lasts much longer.
Yeah.
And so what we're saying here is that everything about identity, all the principles of identity, came to me in the old yogic state prior to 2012. Mm-hmm. But one of the reasons in 2015 my nonprofit collapsed is because I didn't embody yet what had shifted in 2012, and it exposed my patriarchal aspects and dropped them through the floor. Only there was no noose. When the floor dropped below to hang me, I fell through the ground about 20 feet and hit the ground. It's taken me 7 years to figure out what happened and come out the other side. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to just put out there that all of Identity's principles that we're emotional beings first, which is yinic, yep. In its entirety, were conceived and offered and taught before 2012. And now all of the yin dynamics that are pushing up and undermining all the yogic patriarchal dynamicals that are on momentum right now, have been unplugged, is bringing up all the swamp gas.
Yeah. In other words, you were not immune to this shift.
No, but I was not yet embodied. I couldn't embody personally my own teachings. And now I'm just on the shoreline after swimming across the ocean. I've just arrived soaking wet and exhausted on the other side going, okay, I finally have my feet in embodiment. A little bit, my toes are on embodiment sand. I'm not saying I'm all the way healed. I've got to keep embodying the rest of my life. But I am here now, and I just want to put out there that Identity has always had, even before now, the answer to all what ails the world, but was never recognized. I was shouting into a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And so what we've got here is nothing less than challenging literally 5,000 years of spiritual teachings, about 2,000 years of philosophical teachings, 1,500, and about 150 years of psychological teachings are all part of this swamp gas that needs rebooting. And in that sense, maybe I'd like to offer also, Bree wanted to make sure I brought this in, is that because of our unique take on enlightened states, there's a lot of enlightenment states between dualistic Maya and non-dualistic tabula rasa. Sure, yeah. There's expansive-based states. There's oneness-based states. Since 2012, the yin divinity's influence is causing a lot of people, mostly women, to have events that dislocate their consciousness. Collision with the Infinite is a really good example. Amazing book written by a woman who went through a long, over a dozen years of trying to figure out what the hell happened to her. We can decode in Identity, those of you who are out there not knowing how to deal with some event that has happened to you that you weren't even trying to create, but found you. Identity can help. We have the means and the vision and some of the personnel to help you sort out what's happened. There are other people out there doing that, but they're mostly old paradigm folks that are trying to help people do this, not new paradigm. And Identity is a new paradigm of emoto spirituality. So I wanted to make sure that was out here too, is that there's lots of different enlightened states relative to the Maya grasp or resist state. And those all need to be addressed also if it causes you to no longer be able to do your job or be a good parent or not be able to relate to your spouse at the moment. These are real crises going on in people's lives quietly, because a lot of people don't want to make a big deal out of it to be called crazy by our current paradigms.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you have some kind of awakened state and you go to a psychiatrist, they're going to prescribe an antipsychotic for you, probably.
Yes,
It's not going to
exactly
go
right.
very well.
Yeah, if you certainly can't go to your Methodist church and get any help. You can't go
No.
to AA or NA. You can only go to a guru, I guess, but a lot of them are not very approachable to the general public.
Yeah.
So, any rate, if there's some of you who listen to this podcast and you've had an event and you've either closeted it and kept it to yourself and doing the best you can do, or you've really had a dislocation in your personal life, email Joseph or I, and we'll see if we can and give you a hand in being able to understand and integrate what's happened to you.
You've certainly
Okay?
done that for me. You and Bree
Yeah.
both have helped me sort out what was true, what wasn't true, what was left, and it's still
Yeah.
ongoing.
So yeah, Joseph can attest that that there is actually a solution to this. It's not easy, but there is. And last but not least, because of this yin divinity shift, I promise this is the last piece. We've noticed since 2012, there were about a dozen people in our care, quote unquote, that had basically not complete non-dual events, but semi-non-dual events, over a dozen. And the women who went through it, which were more than the men, had a very curious thing that Bree picked up right away. I hadn't gotten it before Bree got it. That when they were in the last throes of panic, as the pre-dual was finding them and eroding their sense of solid noun-eyed dualistic mind-eye self, the few men processed that as the loss of the I, like that's the traditional track.
Yeah.
The women processed it as a loss of other.
Really?
Not the loss of their I, the loss of other. That's a very yinic form. That is a new form of ensoulment, enlightened ensoulment, that now we're looking at with a little more interest, because the day of, like what happened to me, I was literally unconscious that I was unconscious for 10 to 11 minutes. That day may be over. It may be now with the yin divine being having running aegis over our human condition. It could be a softer breath, a sigh, but there will always be some segment of terror there. And if you're a woman or a very sensitive man that has a lot of yin, you may experience enlightenment not as the erosion of your I, but an erosion of everything else that your I experiences.
All right, well, let me run something by you then. Just in the last week, I was at Whole Foods with my girlfriend, and we were talking and what we're going to get, and she just disappeared so fast, like sort of before there was like, okay, I'll meet up with you. There was just didn't do that. She just disappeared so fast while I wasn't looking at her that I was terrified for a moment that she had never existed and I had made the whole thing up.
Wow.
And that's not the first time I've had that experience. Is that kind of what you're talking about? Where it was like,
Yes.
Did I just dream all of this? Does she not even exist? Is that the terror of losing other?
It's the same as terror of not being, but since self and other, capital O, that which we experience, are the same thing, it may be evolving here that even with men who have sufficient yin, as you do, as the soul species that you are, that you may have your event algorithmized by loss of other rather than loss of self. Isn't that interesting?
That's super interesting. And that of course it speaks to the yin era where it's like learning through relationality.
Exactly.
And it has implications around interdependence and, you know, couplehood and all that, because I couldn't feel that if I didn't really love her and really want her in my life. It wouldn't bring up that terror. It would just be like, oh, whatever, she's gone. It was all a dream. I didn't care. But it very much, it was weird because I was having a very, I don't know, I was going to say impersonal experience, but it wasn't really. It was just extremely meta. It was like, I don't know what the hell is true right now. Maybe she never existed. maybe none of this exists, but I was afraid, so it was still personal. So it was
Yes.
personal and relational, but also with this big pre-dual meta vibe to it, like maybe none of this is real at the same time. But I had a personal relationship to the fear that maybe it's not real.
That doesn't dilute
Yeah.
the truth of this event. This was
Uh-huh.
an event, and so this may characterize the way now that it's been course corrected, your non-dual pre-dual non-dual path that
Mm-hmm.
you're on. Now that it's been course corrected and based more in the human, um, now the rest of your event may unfold to its completion in this loss of other way.
Mm-hmm.
If that happens, that's just another unfoldment of the yin divinity shift in the way we've currently defined and experienced, not experienced, the non-experience, not experience of enlightenment.
Would that also shed some light as to why, when we were fighting a lot, why they were so bad? Because it would have this extra intensity. It's not just two people fighting about something, but like the grip of you can't, we have to connect, you can't go. It would explain that, wouldn't it?
It would.
Wow.
In fact, take what you experienced there in that store, and cube it and then cube it again. The way I know your beloved, this would be her explanation for almost every kind of projection problem expressed in personhood, because she's losing other every
Yeah.
moment now, because she's as close as you are,
Yeah.
and never realized how close she was.
Wow. Well, you heard it here first, folks. We just unpacked some amazing new things. I'm not sure what to do with it at the moment, but that's pretty cool that we just did that on the air, as it were. Huh.
Yeah. So even Edenity didn't predict this.
Mm-hmm.
It's just unfolding, and it's just astonishing me. The things that keep unfolding it's not just because I have confirmation bias. Just because you have confirmation bias doesn't mean you're wrong.
Yeah.
It just means you got to really have a lot of critical thinking. Everything that unfolds here, just this item, that the yin based beings are experiencing terror of the loss of other.
Mm-hmm.
That was 7 years ago. Now it might be reaching men who have a lot of yin, and
Mm-hmm.
so that shift is completely unfoldably resonant with the metaphysics of and teachings of Edenity, without it being wanting to do that ahead of time. And that's exactly, it's always the unexpected in science and real science, where beliefs don't drive it. Hypotheses drive science. Hypotheses, not truths that you already have decided on ahead of time, and then you skew your results or interpret your data
Which is what the
according to your
pharmaceutical
beliefs.
companies do with their science. Yeah.
A to Z
Mm-hmm.
is belief-based stuff, not hypothesis-based. It's greed-based
Yeah.
stuff in the big pharma, of course.
Yeah.
So for a coda for today, we could, of course, do probably 33 podcasts on enlightenment, on what's been called enlightenment alone, with
Yeah.
all the vagaries and subtleties to it. We've just hit the high points of the subtleties a little more the second half. But again, I want to announce for the first time that what we're going to do in the near future, I'm going to create something very different called a satsanga.
Uh-huh.
A satsanga. Everyone knows satsang, or a sangha is a group of seekers all united
Community
by,
is the
huh?
translation. Community is the
Yeah,
translation.
community sangha.
Mm-hmm.
And they do satsang with a sadguru, with an enlightened teacher, right? Edenity is going to be offering satsanga, which is an incubation based in the yin divinity stage that we're in, of mental, body, and soulment, in what I'm calling satsanga, that we will be able to do both in person and on Zoom. In other words, I'm taking this one person I've been doing technically satsanga with now for several months now, and I've been learning how to help someone attain whatever level of pre-dual enlightenment is possible to them this life in a very interesting way that's unfolded. And I think I can do that with a group. So we'll be looking for interested people in our own little small community of Edenistic mania, and as our first satsanga, to customize everyone's path according to their soul species, their enneagram point, their childhood wounding, and their spacer way. A specific yin-based way to get you to the next stage of pre-dual enlightenment.
Cool.
So
yeah,
I want to just say that, and I think I'm complete for the day, Mr. Joseph, unless you can think of another rabbit hole.
No, I'm still reeling from that realization, and yeah, that was a rich conversation as always, Stace. Thank you.
Well, blame Bree for that, because she noticed the shift to other rather than I before I did, and she scratched her beautiful head about it, and she thought maybe it was because they were also at the time 7 years ago they were talking about the loss of their beloved while they were slipping away. But now it's going to not just the loss of their beloved, but the loss of otherness is where my intuition knows
the loss of otherness on the way to the experience and experiencer being the same, where there is no other.
Yes.
Which is
no I, no other. Again, they're equivalent in the Buddha's original teaching. See? So otherness and I-ness are equivalent, but everyone's focused on the erosion and the dissolution of the I and not on the otherness. You see?
So in other words, it's still in the category of terror of not being, but it's terror of other not being.
Yes.
Which is the same as you in one way, but it's just sort of flipped in emphasis.
Yes. Exactly.
Wow, that's why. I mean, now that you say that, it makes perfect sense that would change during the yin era.
It would. It would do that because, as you said so beautifully, the algorithm of relationality is yinic, and the algorithm of self is youngic.
Yeah.
So it's being right before our eyes unfolding. So I think it's going to evolve into otherness. And if you happen to have a beloved, that's probably will show up as the first marker for it, and that's fine, as you reported here. But my intuition says it's going to evolve into otherness, and that'll be a different algorithm with the same result. Bringing up the terror of not being, not transcending duality, healing the terror of not being.
Well, and then wouldn't it be, my brain's going so fast it's hard to keep up. Wouldn't the algorithm of the yang version, how do I say this? Let me back up. The healing the fear of other not being would predictably deliver someone to a more relational place than the previous one, right? Because
yes,
you're losing the concept of other, therefore that's going to cause you to experience other more closely, more intimately. Whereas the Yangic version of it, healing the terror of not being oneself, that would be self to self relational, and that's sort of the monk version. You don't need other people; you're just stay on your own.
You're in your cell.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's isn't that wonderful? Yeah. And there's a juncture node with even Sartre's teaching, where I'm simplifying hugely because he's really hard to read sometimes for most people.
Yeah.
That self is created by other, that our sense of being and nothingness, our being without other is indefinable. And so even philosophically, he's talking about this otherness as being intrinsic to the self experience, right? It stops at existential. It doesn't go to spiritual.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, it's really an interesting unfolding dynamic, and satsanga will address this directly. And for some people, going for the loss of otherness may be a much more productive path than the loss of I-ness. They're equivalent.
Yeah, but it's a door more supported by the now.
Yes, by the yin now.
Yeah.
Isn't that something? So yes, even identity can evolve in being open to new unfoldments, but the same assumptions still hold. So we're going to keep at this till we find an experience that completely dissonates with an assumption, and then we'll see if identity can survive that.
That is the cutting edge of the cutting edge right there. Wow.
Yeah.
Well.
All
okay,
right.
Stace.
I'm sorry to exhaust you, but I'm happy to exhaust you.
It's a pleasure being exhausted by you every time. Thank you, Stace. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, listeners, and tune in next time. We'll probably go on to sainthood next time.
Yes, we'll take a micro. We've taken telescopic pictures of sainthood over the last 34 podcasts in some ways, but we're going to do a microscope just like we did here. The felt reality, not just the structure of things. How do those structures in sainthood? How do we experience them? So it'll be a little next level for sainthood too.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you all for listening. And until next time, we wish you well on your journey. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.